was getting ready to take command of the 2nd Stryker Brigade Combat Team, the Lancer Brigade, up at Joint Base Lewis McChord. And I'm very fortunate because starting in about the 2000 time frame, I worked for a series of maneuver theorists who really spent a lot of time investing in my personal development in understanding and applying maneuver theory as a maneuver officer, a combat arms officer. So I was very much the beneficiary of a lot of investment, a lot of study over the years. And what I wanted to do was capture that and portray it explicitly, because there was a major uptick in the war of words and the kinetic activity by North Korea, such that for the first 8 or 9 months of my command, it was reasonable to assume that we were on track to go to war with North Korea. Missile strikes in the seas, shots over Japan, nuclear tests, etc. So first thing I want to talk about is a really important definition. The left-hand side depicts the brigade and higher level fight. From an acronym perspective, MC stands for Mission Command, the Army warfighting function at the time. I believe it's C2 now, Command and Control. The right-hand side, the battalion and below level fight. M plus M stands for Movement and Maneuver, Army warfighting function, and a joint function as well. And in essence, when I think of the brigade fight, my job is to apply Mission Command or Command and Control now, specifically to synchronize the warfighting functions that are going to enable movement and maneuver to happen. My core purpose, as I see it, is exercise command and control, synchronize fire, sustainment, intelligence, and protection, such that I'm setting conditions for the precise application of closing with and destroying through my movement and maneuver forces. When I looked at the battalion level fight, my conceptual model is the battalions exist to do one purpose and do it very well. So the 3 infantry battalions exist to do movement and maneuver. The cavalry squadron is there to generate intelligence and also be part of my kill chain to feed my fires as part of a collection network. And then my sustainment battalions executing sustainment, protection battalions, really that's aligned with the engineers, what they're doing in terms of mobility, counter-mobility, and survivability, and then some of the capabilities they bring. So in essence, at the battalion level, you're executing command and control, now mission command at the time, to bring whatever resources you have along those functions that exist within your formation or that I provide you at the brigade level. And the reason this thing got jokingly nicknamed the bicycle wheels was I do think of the left-hand side, the brigade side. I think of this is like the back wheel of a bicycle. When I'm cranking on my pedals, turning the crankset, turning the chain, this hub here, the Mission Command hub, is in essence like my crankset on my bike, where it is the sprockets that are going to turn the spokes, that are going to turn the wheel. I think of the right-hand side as being like the front wheel on a bike, in that it's turning, pushing the spokes, which is making the hub go, and then that's ultimately how I'm steering the bike and I'm maneuvering things going forward. I realized this fundamental difference in what I was being paid to do, which was set conditions for everyone else to do movement and maneuver or their core functions, and their job was to apply resources to do their core function. This is the real heart of this, this discussion. And if nothing else, this one slide is the one to really keep. This is the collection of maneuver theories that I picked over the years from different theorists that I looked at when I was assessing a tactical or operational problem, what parameters were in play, what variables we knew that therefore we could proceed with, at least the range of those variables, if not make them a constant, and then how that would lay on top of things like the terrain, enemy situation template, and my capabilities, such that I could set conditions to apply one or more maneuver theories towards the objectives I was seeking to do. So these are important enough that I'm going to take a second here to just go ahead and read through them, and then we'll expand them out a little further after I talk about how we would apply these. So the first one is, and these are not in a priority, so this isn't I go to move, strike, protect first. Move, strike, protect comes from JFC Fuller. He likes to talk about the notion of a boxer or 2 boxers in a ring together squaring off. And the boxers are going to throw jabs, that's striking. They're going to try and throw hooks or uppercuts and things like that, knockout punches. They're, as Muhammad Ali would say, dancing like a butterfly. That's the moving phase. They're circling around each other, they're closing in, they're backing off. Maybe they're staying at jab range or they're getting closer for a cross or an uppercut or something like that. And then protecting is that decision the boxer's got to make of, am I keeping one hand up in front of my face, both hands in front of my face? Am I dropping my hands because I'm posturing? And in essence, JFC Fuller's theory centered on a force can do one of these exceptionally well. You can do 2 partially well or reasonably well. And what you really can't do is all 3 well. And so a modern example of that would be If we had a logistics convoy in a counterinsurgency environment going from one base to another, their mission is to move some commodities from point A to point B. They've got to maintain a protect posture, so they've got active security. There may have been a route recon before they went through, or a route clearance in a counterinsurgency environment using that framework. So their primary purpose is to move, but to move effectively in a hostile environment, they've got to protect to some. They can't just, everyone's sitting in the trucks, driving along at 50 miles an hour, not paying attention to the environment. So they've got to balance move and protect. Maybe they're moving slower. Vehicle commanders are up on crew serve weapons or scanning out of windows or something like that. But what they're really not going to do well is strike. So if the enemy ambushes them, arguably what they should do is return fire, continue movement, get out of the engagement area so that they can ultimately continue to move and protect themselves, and that their fires are really defensive fires to allow them to disengage, and that they shouldn't sit there, as an example, dismount their vehicles and attempt to clear the ambush, because they're not equipped for that, they're potentially not trained for that, and it's certainly not aligned with their mission. Much more importantly, though, is not the state you're in, but who is deciding or forcing you to transition from one state to another. So it's really about how can you drive somebody else's transitions, or how can we drive your transitions on the adversary. So I like to think about this as two gears meshing, and each gear is trying to turn the other gear. The next maneuver theory on here is interior and exterior lines of communication. That is ultimately about who's got the tactical and potentially operational flexibility to reposition forces or resources on the battlefield without influence by the other actor. Best example in the world for this is the Battle of LZ X-Ray. So despite the overwhelming combat power that the North Vietnamese army had at LZ X-Ray, Hal Moore possessed interior lines of communication tactically inside of LZ X-Ray. He could reposition forces out of contact, whereas every time the NVA tried to find a different point at which to attack the perimeter, they had to do an exterior lines attack. So they had to reposition cross basically the frontage of 17 Cav and the task force there to get to a new position, to come in on a new avenue of approach to try and attack the perimeter that way. So by virtue of having exterior lines of communication, the NVA could not reposition out of contact, and they had to commit combat power and time in order to conduct that repositioning. So it took longer to move back and forth. Similarly, at the Battle of Little Bighorn, the coalition of Sioux and other nations, they maintained interior lines, so they were able to defeat the first attack in the south and then shift forces, fix the second attack in the center, and then counterattack in the north and defeat Custer's forces with interior lines, whereas Custer deliberately made the decision to do a three-prong exterior lines attack, and he thought he would achieve surprise, didn't, was not able to achieve a mass, and was basically defeated piecemeal along those three exterior lines avenues of approach. I think surfaces and gaps is going to be really salient as you look at the discussion we're having right now with Yakima Training Center and the land there. The way I've always thought about that is if you just took water and you had like this flat hill and you poured water down the hill, every time it hits a surface, a rock or a tree, it's going to flow around that and then go to the gaps. And what's interesting is if we made it a flat battlefield and we had it as two forces, the surfaces are in essence any form of contact that the adversary or either side's putting on the battlefield. So a surface could be a machine gun, and the sector of fires and the effective range of that machine gun puts a direct fires based surface out there such that you can't maneuver through it as long as firers can maintain their rate of fire and they've got them ammunition to do that. So you've either got to directly fight through it, you've got to fight through the indirect fires to get to the obstacle to reduce it, to get to the force to defeat it, or if you think of a surfaces and gaps model, if that's anchored into terrain, so you've got good defensible terrain for the force, they've got good overwatch of the obstacle, they've got good observation out to the fires that are designed to disrupt the force that may try and breach the obstacle, you can basically think of that almost as an impenetrable surface. You can try and defeat it, try and get through it, or you can look for ways to bypass it. So I really, when I look at terrain and I look at forces, this is why the key terrain analysis is so important to me. Because if I can see a piece of key terrain in terms of the observation or field to fire it provides, then I know that that's at least where I would seek to anchor part of, especially if I'm defending, I would seek to anchor my defense there because it'll allow me to take the natural surface of the terrain and then reinforce it with what I'll call man-made surfaces or fires, obstacles, indirect fires, and forces by securing it. And if I'm in the offense, I'll look at that and say, if that key terrain is under enemy control, then it's likely that the enemy is going to put multiple forms of contact anchoring it to bolster the strength of that surface. And I'm going to look for gaps either in the defense or how the terrain might allow me to flow around that surface. Continuing, maneuver-based fires versus fires-based maneuver. And I know some of these sound binary. In the end, they're not one or the other, but they're just a nice framework for starting to look at a problem. So maneuver-based fires versus fires-based maneuver. The Russians unequivocally are a maneuver-based fires force. There's a bit of a quip that the Russians are an artillery army with tanks. They seize terrain so that they can bring fires forward, so they can range with fires. They put overwhelming fires on their threat until they've reduced it sufficiently that they can maneuver through what they've reduced with the fires, and then they continue that. And if you look at the robustness of their defense, they put nearly impenetrable surfaces out there on their surfaces and gaps model because of the heavy volume of fires, reinforcing complex obstacles. We in the West, we like to think that we fight fires-based maneuver, but I think the reality is we do maneuver-based fires as well. And I would offer as example, what we did in the Pacific Theater unequivocally was we did operational maneuver, island hopping, such that we could build an airbase, so we could put bombers there, so that we could extend our operational reach. And with the extended operational reach, we could bomb the next objective. And in essence, we just continued to close in on mainland Japan until we had operational reach in mainland Japan. And every one of those maneuver fights, as violent as they were, as many casualties as they incurred, arguably we were conducting maneuver, operational level in a theater, to set conditions to extend the reach of our fires assets. I think you could actually look at World War I on both sides, and I think you could look at World War II in the European theater and see the same thing. And I think if we look at the statistics from World War II and every conflict since, the number of casualties that are caused by fires versus direct fire weapon systems, I think continues to reinforce that in the end, there's a reason we call it King of Battle, because it's incredibly effective, and future campaigns would potentially entail the U.S. Army as a supporting force to the joint force, setting conditions where we have the operational reach we need with Army and joint fires to achieve theater level objectives as well. So I think, and in times you switch, you might use fires to suppress a target so you can clear a piece of terrain, seize that terrain, move your PAAs, your position area artilleries forward so that you've got the range of your artillery. You're going to dedicate some combat power to securing that artillery, and with that extended range, you're going to set conditions for what's next. I do think in the end, our principal defeat mechanism is destruction in the U.S. military, and I think we achieve destruction principally through the application of joint fires, and I think maneuver forces ultimately exist to set conditions for us to apply joint fires. ISD methodology is a really fun one. It stands for isolate, suppress, destroy. Now I have this comment in here in parentheses says really CSD. I would argue, words have meaning, and if we were to look doctrinally, I don't know that you can isolate a force on the battlefield, in the modern battlefield, like truly cut it off from the world. So this was an old school, this is a Napoleonic era idea brought through Yomani and then revisited between World War I and World War II. So ISD, I'm going to call CSD. Contain, suppress, destroy. It's a way to conceptualize, I'm going to say chunk, and it's almost like a chipper wad in CrossFit. So if a workout says you got to do 100 pull-ups, I can't do 100 pull-ups anymore. But what I can do is a set of 10 pull-ups, and then I can do 10 more, and then I can do 10 more. And so a chipper wad says you're not doing 100 pull-ups, you're doing 10 sets of 10, spaced out however you need, or 20 sets of 5, or whatever the case may be. So the notion of CSD is it's a straight sequential about how you apply combat power to reduce surfaces on the battlefield. So this is where the linkages start to come in. So if the enemy's got a strong point defense, securing a piece of key terrain that in essence presents a surface, and there's no gaps where I can bypass that force. It's a good strong point, it's got good observation fields of fire, and it's tied into two more strong points, and they have overlapping sectors of fire. So I can't go, let's just say it's 3 hilltops, A, B, and C, and then they have good overwatch along 2 routes that go between A and B and B and C. And those are my 2 avenues of approach to my primary objective, which is, let's say, the residual battalion defense behind these 3 platoon strong points. If I look at that and I say the aggregated combat power of 3 platoons in strong point defense with overlapping fields of fire, they probably have integrated supporting fires and integrated obstacle effects. It's sort of like the whole how do you eat the elephant one bite at a time. If I take the 3 platoon strong points and I look at which one has a vulnerability I can exploit. Let's say it's an assailable flank. Maybe one of them is a nice piece of key terrain, but it's next to some woods, and I could potentially exploit that with a flanking force. Then the notion of CSD is if I can contain that force so that the other force or forces aren't supporting it, and then I can suppress it with direct and indirect fires or joint fires, depending on what's available, then I can reduce that, destroy it, and then I have just taken and I've started to unhinge that defense. So let's say I go after battle position C. We'll call it, objective C. And objective C is a platoon strong point, but I can assail it through the flank through some restrictive terrain where adversary can't drive vehicles, even if he's got an active security posture there because he's protecting and he's prepared to strike in a move, strike, protect model. If I can assail that flank and reduce that strong point defense, now the enemy doesn't have 2 platoons overwatching Route 2 between B and C. He's only got 1 platoon overwatching Route 2, and that platoon may or may not be able to completely affect Route 2. The platoon may not have the fields of fire to get all the way over to cover the entire route. And now I've got the opportunity to unhinge that defense if I want to continue from objective C to objective B, or if I want to simultaneously or sequentially attack objective A, and now the 2 flank forces are out, and objective B is the only residual force, and I can mass on it, or I can potentially bypass it based on how the routes and the terrain support. In essence, say, I'm just going to focus on this one force, and I'm going to CSD this thing. I'm going to contain it, and then I'm going to suppress it, and then I'm going to destroy it, and then I can start to work piecemeal versus trying to do like a wholesale attack, like a company attack against 3 or a battalion attack against 3 platoon strong points. So that's just a methodology for piecemealing the adversary array of forces such that you can defeat him piecemeal versus trying to defeat the adversary wholesale, where you're potentially playing into their strengths versus exploiting a vulnerability or weakness that they present if you can chunk them to smaller components. The expanding torrent model it's a little bit of an extension of surfaces and gaps and water flowing downhill. This was applied a lot by the Germans in World War I. I think that's really where the theory emerged. And this is similar to what we just talked about with this CSD example. If you can mass to create a single point of penetration in your enemy's defense, and you have sufficient combat power to exploit that, then the notion is, like if you had a dirt wall and you got a crack in it, and then water was flowing through that fissure, what it does is it erodes the fissure and it widens it as the water starts to go through it and expand out. So in essence, that single point of penetration can start to grow laterally to a more and more clear point of penetration to become a route to then become an avenue from which you can continue your attack. So the example would be like if we go back to CSD, if you clear objective C and then you clear objective B and you decide to bypass A, you just suppress it and fix it, you could come back and laterally clear or clear objective A from the rear if those forces didn't surrender or choose to retrograde as you went through it. So arguably, rather than expanding torrents, about if you can mass sufficient combat power and preserve enough, especially if you have interior lines, preserve enough combat power to exploit that, then you can clear laterally or clear in depth once you've got that single point of penetration. And then the last thing, fairly well known, but this ultimately goes back, it's the underpinning, and the reason I have this last on the list, it's really foundational to any of these theories that you go through, and it's the Boyd cycle or the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. Whoever wins observation, whoever observes the enemy first, or visual contact, if we want to use the forms of contact in Army doctrine, whoever gets visual contact first and observes controls the tempo of the engagement, and they control the transitions. So if I'm in an ambush and I observe you before you see my ambush, I am controlling. I'm deciding. I've observed you. I've oriented. I've alerted my weapon systems. Everybody's up. We're all ready to go. We have some trigger for the ambush. Enemy meets the trigger for the ambush. We initiate the ambush. We're acting. And what's interesting is if, let's say you're moving along, you have no idea the ambush is there, so you never observe the ambush, you never oriented on it until the enemy shooting direct fire weapon systems and maybe employing indirect weapons on you, fires on you, you're now trying to reacting to contact. I'm trying to observe and orient, decide and act while being hit with at least one, if not multiple forms of contact, all them being kinetic contact as well. So the underpinning for these theories is setting conditions so that you observe first, or the term would be win visual contact. If you win visual contact, you are then controlling the transitions, you're controlling the engagement. And that ultimately is why I start with a key terrain analysis. And when I do key terrain analysis, I'm basically looking for maximal observation of fields of fire as my start point. And so when I look at the terrain, I'm looking at where can I see and shoot the farthest direct fire weapon systems, because seeing allows me to employ indirect fire weapon systems. Seeing allows me to win observation in the OODA loop. And if it lets me maximize the effects of my weapon systems, then in essence, I'm creating a deeper and potentially broader surface that you're going to have to fight through. And then I can place my obstacles based on what I can affect with my direct fire weapon systems. As you're approaching the obstacle, I've got fires integrated, and now I've got maybe not truly impenetrable, but I've got a really, really tough surface. And if I manage it around the terrain correctly, the lateral terrain, where you can't bypass me, now you've got to fight through multiple forms of contact to reduce my position.